All right, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another edition of our Wild Conversation series. This morning we have Andrea Brown with us, the former chair of the Police Conduct and Oversight Commission. Before we get started, I'll just go over a few of our webinar features. All attendees are on mute. We do encourage questions. If you have questions, feel free to put those into the Q&A box or in the chat, and we'll make sure that those get to our webinar moderator and presenter. If we do need to restart this webinar for any reason, check your email for a new link. And we are recording this session as well. This is part of our Wanton Injustice Legal Detail Initiative. WILD's mission is to harness the collective power of Twin Cities Diversity and Practices membership to remedy systemic anti-Black racism in the Twin Cities by partnering with and amplifying the work of existing community organizations. I'm glad our moderator is here with us today. Welcome to Lucas Castor, who is a civil rights and plaintiffs employment lawyer at Nichols Castor. He's also a member of the Minnesota Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. And he's also a lead of our Emerging Leaders Group, specifically for the recruiting portion of our programming. And also, if you enjoy this series, stay tuned for our next edition in this series with Aaron May-Quaid. That's on December 17th at 9 a.m. next week. And with that, we will go ahead and get started.
Hello, everybody. I was just taking myself off mute there for a minute, as we're all used to these webinars and having technical problems. But thank you, Liz, for the introduction. Welcome, everybody. I'm glad to see so many people joining us this morning. As Liz said, we're here for our fourth conversation as part of our Wild Conversation series about addressing systemic racism in community policing. And we intend to have a few more conversations as part of this series after the new year. These series are intended to be educational, so everyone can hear the different thoughts and ideas on how we can make the police department and community safety better. So welcome to everybody this morning. And I'm excited to welcome Andrea Brown this morning. Andrea is a public defender in Ramsey County. She's the former chair of the Minneapolis Police Conduct and Oversight Commission. I think we discussed yesterday for, 6 years. We were going back and forth about how long it was. But most important to me, Andrea is the much, much better half to one of my very good friends from grade school. And so she's a dear friend of mine. So welcome, Andrea. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. It might get a little wild, so good thing it's in the morning. We have coffee.
That's right. That's right. So let's talk a little bit. I introduced some of your background. You're a graduate of Augsburg. You went to William Mitchell Law School. Originally from Minnesota, right?
No, I'm not. I'm originally from Columbia, Monticello, Columbia. I was adopted and brought here at 9 months, and then grew up in rural Buffalo, Minnesota.
Right.
So kind of a big gamut of things.
Yeah.
Which I think really helped me especially when we get more into it on the PCOC, just getting those different life, life experiences and then bringing it to, my career and what I'm passionate about, which is police policy. So. Sure.
And we were talking yesterday, and we've talked about this before, obviously, but, it seemed like to me, you had an interest in getting involved in doing public defender work, being a lawyer from a very young age. Can you explain that to us?
That is correct. So about 13 is when I decided I wanted to be a public defender. And it really just goes back to my grandparents and my mom and my family. They just kind of instilled in me always fighting for somebody that may be less fortunate than you. So use your position that you have and be that helping hand.
Sure.
I took a law, justice, and you class in 7th grade, and we had an amazing speaker come talk about, how public defenders are seen one way in society, but really what they do is they defend the Constitution. And if you believe in the Constitution and you believe in, rules and laws being applied equally to everybody, that this might be an avenue you're interested in. And I kind of just fell in love with the idea of public defense and helping those that can't afford, as a public defender, you have thick skin, right? I'm told every day that I'm not a real attorney, or I have to prove that I'm an attorney, real attorney. As a woman, I have to prove that I'm, a real attorney. So it gives you a thicker skin. And for me, that I want people who may not believe that I'm a real attorney, right? I want them to have the best attorney that they can have, and they don't have to go pay, hundreds of thousands of dollars for equal representation. And so that's what I love about the public defenders. We are all diehards and we fight tooth and nail.
Yeah, and we, talk a little bit to us about how you eventually got into the public defender's office, what your experience was before you got there.
Yeah, so I graduated law school in 2009 from William Mitchell. And unfortunately, it was called the donut year because a lot of us didn't have jobs. It was a really bad time to be graduating. So I essentially, applied for jobs, didn't get any, and ended up finally getting a job at the Civil Rights Department, actually, as an investigator doing, I was on EEOC type of complaints, making sure at that time that department was all one. So you did police misconduct investigations along with employment complaints and the whole gamut. And while I was there, I was only there for a month, but while I was there, it was really noticed by the director at that time that there needed to be a specific avenue for police misconduct complaints. And that was back in 2009. That was recognized that there is this overwhelming number of complaints that were never able to be gotten to see if they had merit and could move forward. Simultaneously, as this is happening, we have the CRA, right, going at the same time. And I know we might get into the history a little bit further down the road, but as I'm working in the complaints office, getting out of law school my first year, like I said, in the month that I was there, there were so many complaints that weren't able to get to because we are all, having to manage a whole gamut of things, that they really that office started focusing on, we need to focus on these police misconduct cases, the complaints, and see what's in there. From there, I went to go clerk for Judge Stephenson. So my time at the Civil Rights Department was very short, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. And before I took the position with Judge Stephenson, I spoke to my boss there saying, hey, I'm not the type of person who takes a job and leaves within a month. So I'm having really big concerns about this. But they said clerking for a judge is an opportunity you don't get often, so you need to go. And I was with Judge Stephenson for about 5 years before the public defenders hired me. I law clerked there through law school, but as you get to know me within the next hour, I think my personality will let you know I don't really take no for an answer. So I applied to the public defenders 7 times and interviewed 7 times before they hired me. And I think it's just because at the very end, I said, look, if you don't hire me this time, you're going to seriously regret it. And I guarantee you in 6 months, you're going to say, we should have hired her 7 years ago. And I'm happy to say that I think all of my managers agree with me. That I was finally a good hire.
That's great. I remember us having conversations about that as you were going through that process. And obviously your persistence paid off. And you referenced earlier, the CRA. For people who may not be familiar with that, what are you referring to when you say that? So
yes, for people who don't know. So before PCOC existed, so Police Conduct Oversight Commission, and that's near and dear to my heart. It's kind of my baby, if you will, because the PCOC that people have been learning about now never started out that way. In fact, it started as the Civilian Review Authority. And essentially what had happened is that they took in complaints of police misconduct, and they were charged with also doing policy and training. And so the Civilian Review Authority had, I can't tell you how many number of people on it, but it had a number of people on it, and they reviewed these complaints. One of the problem areas with the CRA is that they could never get to the policy portion of complaints because there was a lot of focus on each individual complaint and helping that person. And really what was noticed is that at the Civil Rights Department, I believe it was a Civil Rights Director, as well as Michael Brown, who's now a Judge Brown in Hennepin County, really sat down and thought of how can we in Minneapolis be proactive about this, right? It was starting to notice all the complaints coming in at the complaint level, and that there really needed to be focus, 2 or 3 investigators on those complaints, right? And the CRA then, you look at the CRA and saying, hey, they're not getting to the policy portion because there's all these cases. So something needs to be done, right? We need to be innovative and inventive and come up with a model that would work, right? Because it's not that the CRA wasn't working, it just wasn't working as well. To take a line from my aunt and uncle, who I know are watching, it's process improvement, right? How can we improve this process? And so that's what happened. The PCOC was created and the OPCR was created out of the need for Minneapolis to have a hybrid model. And let me know if I'm going in too deep, but our current model, the hybrid model, initially, was kind of laughed at in the law enforcement world. So for people who don't follow law enforcement policy, there's a national oversight. It's called NACOL, National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement. And it's essentially where a whole bunch of civilian law enforcement watchdogs or commissions, if your city has it, get together every year and talk and share how, what's working, what's not working, and how we can get civilian law enforcement oversight in every state and every police department. And so we had the hybrid model, and that was very scary to some people. But essentially what it did, it took the pressure off of each individual case. That's still being done, right? There's a panel that reviews each individual case and they decide if it's worth merit or not. And that's compiled of civilians as well as sworn officers. And then PCOC part is the policy part, right? The part that focuses on the patterns, the trends, and I know I'll get to that much later, but for example, the ketamine study that came out, that came from exactly what we were charged with, is following patterns and trends and seeing it and moving forward and acting upon it. So when we were able to really focus on the policy portion, it's not that I don't enjoy each personal story, and I think that that's where my public defender background comes in. I know how important the individual story is, the individual interaction is, but I think one of the skill sets that I've learned from PCOC and in that role is that I take that story and we made it data, right? Because I'm sure that you all know, especially those who work in corporate America, data is what talks, and data is what gets the funding. And statistics so that we could show, hey, this is what's going on in Minneapolis. Here's what needs to be fixed, and here's what doesn't need to be fixed, and how do we do that simultaneously?
So if I understand what you're saying correctly, that basically the model went from the CRA being sort of a one-stop shop for all the complaints, all of the issues, to splitting up the CRA into these 2 separate bodies, the PCOC committee, the Police Conduct Oversight Commission, and then the OPCR, which is the complaint part of it, right?
Yeah, so I mean, I think of it, I'm sorry, I'm a visual, I always use my hands. So if you think about it, Civil Rights Department's up here, right? Underneath that is the OPCR, Office of Police Conduct Review, right? There's other offices on that same level, but just focus on ours. And then underneath that would be the PCOC. So just like city council would give directives, hey, you need to go do this. You know, there's a motion passed at a meeting and then they direct somebody to go actually do what they just motioned on. That's what we did. PCOC, we had motions. If we wanted to research or investigate something, that motion was passed and it was talked about at the meeting and it was passed, and then OPCR is the one charged with it, with doing it. And I fully support that office. I think they need to be fully funded and fully staffed. I mean, so that because people aren't in there, so you can see kind of behind the door, they have 2 investigators. That's not enough. They have 2 intake people. That's not enough. They have 1 person watching all this body cam video. That's most definitely not enough. And those pieces are super important. And I can jump into that now or get into it later of why they're so important.
Yeah, and we can talk about that here in a minute. I want to give people a little bit more sort of overview of the PCOC committee itself. And can you talk about, who's on the committee, how it works, that sort of thing for people who may not be familiar?
Sure. So the commission, and how I found the commission was I had moved back from St. Paul to Minneapolis after getting married. So I moved to Minneapolis, and I was heavily involved in St. Paul, and I wanted to be involved in Minneapolis. So I went on the City of Minneapolis website and found all the commissions and charters and committees. And I found the PCOC commission, and I was very interested because it's policy work. And I'm interested in policy, but it's also policing. And I thought, this is great. As a public defender, I cross-examine cops on the stand all the time. And I frankly don't believe a lot of cops. And, I attack cops all the time. This will be perfect. So I looked at the criteria, and the criteria was, fill out this application. And then there's an interview process. So they interview you. And if, just like a job, if they like you, they call you back for a second interview. And interviewed. And I can tell you right now, it was a horrible interview. I know I was, because I was told that wasn't the best interview, but I feel like you were just nervous. And I was, because I'm honest, right? I can't lie about what I don't know. So that was kind of the one thing about PCOC, is that a lot of people don't know what it actually does, right? They don't understand that it's the HR portion of police misconduct. So, once I got picked from there, you had to present in front of city council as to why they should secure your appointment. Right. So it's very serious. It's different than, I would say, other committees or commissions because of the process that you have to go through to get it. Like, they really want people who are serious about this work, who can understand the work, or at least are interested in learning about what this work entails. So from there, I met with Mayor Rybeck, and at that time, Mayor Rybeck was the one who the charter in our specific chapter said that the chair was appointed by the mayor. They had to sit with the mayor because there was a vested interest in the mayor being a part of this, right? So I met with Mayor Rybeck, and a couple other people did, and then Mayor Rybeck ended up appointing me as chair. And we started from there, but I started with inception. So, I mean, to be honest, I had no idea what I was doing, right? I didn't know how this would run, if it ran like a courtroom or, it's just a group meeting. So PCOC had to establish integrity and credibility, and so there were some bumps in the road initially, but that's the process. That's how I got there. Sure. Somebody saw something in me and took a chance on me, and I think that that's the epitome of what you guys are doing with these series, right? You're talking to people who may have not had a chance prior, and how do we get other people to get chances so that we can actually make real change?
Yeah. That's great. And one of the things when I was sort of looking into, preparing for today, I was looking at the PCOC committee's website, and I'll put in the chat function for anybody who's interested, a link to the website for the PCOC commission. But one of the things I saw was, and I do this as part of the Minnesota advisory to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, is basically we start research projects. And then the idea is to support change through actual data, like you were talking about, and research, and come forward with suggestions on what they can do. Is that sort of what the PCOC committee does?
That is correct. So the commission would give, to look at patterns and trends, but also at our meetings, right? A lot of our ideas came from the civilians who showed up. And so yes, we looked at patterns and trends, and then we did research studies on them, right? The methodology behind it, what would be looked into, what specifically tailored. And then yes, we came out with, and I'll use my notebook as an example, like pages, right? And you can see on the website, there's the body cam. I mean, body cam, I don't know if people understand. Initially, Mayor Hodges and Chief Harteau came to our meeting, Tuesday night meeting, showed up and said, we are asking PCOC to take full charge of the community aspect of this. Look into body cams, look into what's happening nationwide, best practices, look into, you know, what the civilians want. So we ended up having 3 listening sessions. I mean, it's a huge project, right? That my 7 commissioners and I are doing because we love our community, right? We do this for free, we don't get paid. And then, you know, the people who work at the OPC office, that's their job, right? So there's integrity in their job of doing this. They wanted to do it well. I mean, I'm happy to say that after, I guess, you know, for so long, they finally accepted all of our recommendations initially. But I'm not happy to say that a lot of tragic things in Minneapolis had to happen in order for them to accept our recommendations. And I think that that middle part is where we really need to focus on. We need to start being more proactive as Minneapolis. And historically, we have been. So we need to get back there.
Right. And one of the, you know, you referenced some of the studies that have been done, you know, in looking at and talking with you in preparation, you know, we were talking about what you referenced as sort of the hybrid model. And we were talking about, and I was asking you, you know, what authority, you know, if you're working with the mayor or the chief of police in the OPCR, and you come forward with a recommendation on something, what authority do you have as the PCOC committee or the chair to make sure that that happens? How does that work?
Well, one is just if they're scared of me enough to not want to get me upset. But in all seriousness, we do have support because we are backed by, so the Civil Rights Department is how we are funded, right? And we work in conjunction with OPCR. So there is support there because obviously at the time, right, the city council and the mayors were on board with, you know, supporting this hybrid model and seeing it through. As far as the teeth that we had, I mean, that's what really we had to create and establish within the first few years of us being there. I met frequently just so people could know me, right, and know my integrity and know my word, because in order for you to accept my recommendations, you really have to accept what I'm doing, right, and my vision as well as my perspective, saying that I think this is important, right, and here's why I think it's important. I really try to maintain and keep the PCOC very, very neutral, and I think that that's a skill set that I learned from Judge Stephenson, because he's very neutral from case to case in his courtroom. And I knew that that was important because, you know, PCOC, and I've said this numerous times at my meetings, I'm not always going to agree with the citizens, and they're not always going to like what I have to say. And I'm not always going to agree with the officers or the MPD or what they're doing or what they say at all. But I will be neutral and tell you, hey, this needs to change, or this is good, and here's why I feel that it's good. So as far as teeth, I mean, that's how the teeth was created, is that we established our credibility, right? Our research and studies were amazing. Our body cam policy was amazing. And that is amazing work that people just did. There was no really format on how to do it. It was just thought about like, let's do it this way. One thing that I think PCOC did initially early on to establish our credibility is that we knew we didn't know what we didn't know, right? So we asked people. And I think that's the biggest point is, hey, everybody, it's not just certain parts of Minneapolis we're asking. Hey, North Minneapolis, what do you need? What do you want? What do you need to see? right?
Yeah. And that was one of the things that, when we were discussing this, that you were talking about that is somewhat unique to the PCOC committee, at least in Minneapolis, is that they have the ability and openness to have public comment and public input into where things go. And you referenced specifically what we'll talk a little bit more about here in a minute is how the research into responding to mental health crises and people having a mental health issue, how that came about was from a public comment, right?
That is correct. So I know some of my commissioners are on here as well, and they'll probably hate the fact that I'm going to shout them out. But yeah, that's what happened at our meetings. And that was something that the citizens fought for initially. So initially at our meetings, there was not public comment, right? Because traditionally, that's how every other commission or committee or club or even our own city council runs, right? Is that there's only public comment at certain times. Well, the citizens who came to our meetings were like, that's not cool. That's not right. I want to be able to speak. So even that in itself, okay, I didn't know that. So that was an easy change to instill. We instilled that change, and yeah, we created a safe space for civilians to come and say, hey, here's a complaint I put in, where's it at? Or here's a complaint I haven't lodged because I don't think it's going to go anywhere. Can you help me? Can you direct me? And so we had a woman come in, and I remember it as plain as day. She came in and she had nowhere else to turn. She said, I've been yelling and screaming that I'm scared that my family member is going to get killed by the Minneapolis police because he is mentally ill. And I'm scared to death and I don't know what to do. And from there, two of my commissioners who are amazing, who both have been vice chair, I'm going to shout them out. Laura Westfall and Jennifer Singleton are amazing. They took time to speak with this woman after and say, this is what we need to do. A motion was created at our meeting to say, not only are we going to look into this issue, but we're going to look into see what we can do. From there, the co-responder pilot program was created. And it's a really huge deal because currently nationwide, there are all these other co-responder models occurring and happening and appearing. And it's really based off of a lot of our pilot work that we did. And I think it was back, you probably have the date better than I do, but back in 2016, when we got the pilot program for the co-responder model funded. I mean, I was geeked when I heard that city council and the mayor, and I believe it was Betsy Hodges at the time, was going to give us $500,000 to try to get this program started and to work out. And from there, and just a little bit about the program is the way that was created is that we had people at the table that are actually living this day to day. And I think that that's what made the part of the program so successful, right? It's not just a whole bunch of people who think they know what mental health crisis is needed. We were talking to the moms and dads and the brothers and the sisters and the people who are calling the cops who are worried about this. And then the social workers and the mental health professionals that do this on a daily basis. So we have the people at the table who are involved, who need it. And it's not just, me thinking, oh, I think this is how it should go.
Yeah. And, we were also talking about this in preparation is, there's been a lot of, in response to everything that happened this summer and the murder of George Floyd and all these discussions about police reform and defunding the police. One of the things that has come out of that and has been a central theme or a consistent theme has been this idea of creating a co-responder model. And obviously we're in 2020 and you're right. It was 2016 when PCOC did that initial research and then recommended the pilot. And I put the PDF of that research and study that the PCOC committee did in the notes for anybody who's interested. You can find all of this on the website as well. So there's been a lot of talk that we need to create a co-responder model. And you were saying that model, at least in some way, already exists. Now we may be able to improve it, right?
Right. But it does exist. Absolutely. And it has been existing. I mean, one of the issues is that it wasn't fully funded right away. right? And when you say it's not fully funded, that means it's not in every area in Minneapolis, right? So
What do you mean by that?
so it's not in the areas that I think it needs to be in. It's not in South Minneapolis. It's not in North Minneapolis. It's not in areas of color where people of color need this service, right? And then, I can go historically on it that, historically people of color haven't seen investment into mental health services, right? Either on their own accord or, they don't see anybody helping with their needs, right? Their specific needs. So having a co-responder model that's available to everybody in Minneapolis was the number one important piece. As a pilot program and as funding happens, is that, you have to start with certain areas. So we did have it, and there were limitations, right? You could call for a mental health crisis up until 5 p.m. Well, once you look at the statistics and you talk to the people who live in this and do this work, you have no idea when a mental health crisis is going to happen. Oh, it's 5:06. I can't have one. That's not true, right? So the co-responder model did eventually get expanded to the entire city. I don't think it was 24 hours though. But one of the benefits of the co-responder model that I don't believe is currently still there with this latest budget that just was passed by the city council. I think our co-responder model that has been around since 2016 was essentially not funded, defunded, and replaced with a new program. So I think that's the crisis intervention team that I hear floating around. But the co-responder model worked because on the MPD side, which maybe a lot of people didn't know since they didn't know that co-responder was there, is that on the MPD side, you have to apply to be an officer who responds to mental health crisis. So it was realized early on, right, that not all cops have certain skill sets, and we know this, right? We know from all of the murders of innocent Black people by cops, right? And we know this. So it's kind of twofold as we go forward, right? One is not all cops are trained or equipped to do this, but yet we as society, anyone has a mental health crisis, we immediately call the cops. And that needs to change, right? So that's what we were trying to do within this. That was the concern by the citizen. They're not trained to do this. Their 40 hours of CIT training is not helpful, right? It's just like my 40 hours of bankruptcy law. I'm probably not a good bankruptcy attorney, right? But I'm one heck of a public defender because I know criminal law, right? So same thought within the MPD is if you want to be a part of this pilot program, this, co-responder model, because you are dealing with people in mental health crisis and you will be dealing with, mental health therapists and social workers, that you need to want to be here. So part of the reason that the program worked so well was because the officers had to apply to be in it. And so those officers wanted to be in it and took an interest in value in it. I don't know what's going to happen now. Unfortunately, from what I learned yesterday is that, yes, that now it has been completely defunded, which I think is a detriment to the city and the civilians in Minneapolis.
And I've seen the news break as well about the city council's vote, and obviously you shared that at least if they're cutting of funding means defunding of what was established as the co-responder model, or funding for having non-police officers respond with a trained police officer. In those scenarios, my assumption is, based on our conversation, that you would not agree with cutting that funding.
That's correct. I won't agree with cutting it, but I'm not that type of person that thinks, okay, this isn't working, let's rip it out and move forward with something else. Because I always think about in the meantime, right? So in the meantime, because crisis intervention team hasn't been created yet, and there's no program, and we have no idea what's going to happen, if you're not funding something like the co-responder model in the meantime, now what do we do? Now what do civilians in Minneapolis do? Now what does this woman who fought very hard to get a program to help her family members, what does she do? What does she go back to? And so that's concerning to me. But we can't all carry everything. The concern was with PCOC is if we lost our foundation, we lost the people who had been there through the past 6 years, right, that we'd have to have a rebuilding and reestablishing time. It currently sees that that's what it looks like right now. And that's unfortunate, but can we recover? Yes, absolutely. Can we process improve and really keep PCOC going and working in conjunction with city council and the current mayor? Absolutely.
And one of the things, it was interesting when I was taking a look at the study that PCOC did back in 2016 about the co-responder model. There was some reference to other departments. There was a reference to Duluth having started a co-responder model, and then also what really struck me was the LA Police Department and the numbers of non-police mental health professionals that are part of that department, or at least were, in terms of the time when you were doing that study. Can you talk a little bit about that?
In what aspects? Yeah, because yes, so Duluth had it, and when we do the research and studies, I think it's in the methodology portion. It talks about who we, and I say we as PCOC, right? Who we talk to in order to help get our data and then to create a program that would work for Minneapolis. So we did speak with a lot of people in Duluth, as well as I think, I can't remember which commissioner did, but even went up to Duluth to see how it works. Now, obviously, they're very much smaller than Minneapolis, and they don't have certain issues the way that Minneapolis does. So we try to get as much knowledge from them as what works, and tailor it specifically for Minneapolis. Similarly with LA. Now, LA is their own interesting law enforcement oversight because essentially what they did is went from having to fight tooth and nail to even get access into MPD to see their data or see, employment misconduct or IA complaints, right? To now they actually get paid. It is the chair of their commission is a paid position. I met him last year, I think it was last year in New York. And it's actually a paid position. And it's an interesting way that they went with that model because it allows their people to be more, well, they put it, more invested in their work because now it's their career, right? So that's why they need the number of officers, and they have a larger budget, right? So they can employ and get more non-officers involved.
Yeah, and I want to go back to this idea that you referenced earlier. You were talking about, the hybrid model, and we talked about the differences between OPCR and PCOC. But one of the things you referenced in our discussions yesterday was, this idea that the PCOC relies on getting data from MPD and OPCR and getting it in a timely way so they can provide recommendations to what's happening in real time, and how that might be different. Like you referenced, they had the other departments or previously had to sort of fight tooth and nail to get access to the data to actually recommend changes, right? And I think you referenced the idea that that's one of the positives of the hybrid model in Minneapolis and sort of working more collaboratively. Can you talk a little bit about how that came about and why it was established the way it was?
Sure. I think so. Initially, the hybrid model was to eliminate that confrontation, right? So I'll start with something that maybe some people, or at least the listeners, may understand is the subpoena power, right? There's been since actually the murder of Jamar Clark, there has been a lot of talk about subpoena power and how other civilian oversights need subpoena power. The power of the subpoena, if you will, if you're not an attorney, means that I can force somebody to talk to me or to hand over documents, and it's court ordered, and so you have to do it, right? The hybrid model doesn't need that. I don't need subpoena power to force this, for me to get this data from internal affairs, because the way that it's set up is that the internal affairs director and the director of the OPCR work jointly. So she gets to see, or he gets to see, what internal affairs has and that data. So I don't need a subpoena. I don't need to ask a judge to get a subpoena in order for me to get that information from OPCR, from MPD. I just say, go get it, and you get it. And so
how does that differ from, people who are getting data through, for example, an open records request? Or how does that data differ from what you would see as part of the PCOC?
Well, it goes back to the real time, right? So any data that is not gotten from the OPCR, and I know that, there's been a lot of changes within Minneapolis and Minneapolis, like city council and who controls what. At one time, all of our stuff was online where you could easily click and just grab the information. I don't know if it's still there, but OPCR did quarterly reports, right? Where you could see the data change from each quarter, right? So you could really see the movement of cases, right? These cases are in coaching. Well, now they're not, or these cases are the ones that are in merit, or these are all the officers who have been fired, but now it's being grieved by the union, right? Which we could have a conversation 2 hours on the union itself, right? And so, so that is all those hurdles we don't need.
Sure. And so one of the, you were just referencing, officer discipline. And I think that's been one of the themes and discussion points that has happened and has occurred since everything this summer is how do we hold officers more accountable when they have done something wrong? Do you have an opinion about what we could do to improve that?
I will always have an opinion.
I know that.
But especially on this issue, because and it really all started with the murder of Jamar Clark, as far as my interest in what happens, right? Because when I was on the PCOC, where are the HR portion, right? So how do I aid in curbing this? Because it's one thing to now we have the dashboard, and we have the dashboard where you can put in somebody's number, badge number, and see how many complaints they had. That came from PCOC. You would never be able to access that but for our hybrid model and but for us being able to do that. And that really came from, a study from the ACLU study that initially talked about disparities in Minneapolis. We took that process, improved it, because we have the real-time data, right? Because the only way you get data, so the only way the ACLU gets data, right, or CUAPB or any civilian gets data, is you have to make a data request. And once you get that data request, there's all this other data that you didn't get because time has passed, right? So the statistics coming from there may be old, right? And so you want real up-to-date statistics, which is what did come out of the PCOC and the OPCR office.
And how do we, what is your thought on how we actually, in terms of, is there something that you think could be done, with OPCR or some other means to do this to, hold and keep the officers accountable who have engaged in misconduct? We've heard proposals about professional liability insurance, about other types of proposals that have been discussed to try to hold officers accountable and potentially weed out the bad officers who are continually doing these types of things. Do you have thoughts on that?
I do. I think it lies within the post board. When I was thinking about, what happened to George Floyd and him being murdered and all of us witnessing it, and then, the talk of defunding the police came out, I gave some thought. I got a lot of phone calls, a lot of people interested in my opinion, and I really took time to think about what I think is needed in Minneapolis, as well as what I think citizens need. And they need to know that that if you shoot and kill somebody, right, the licensing board takes your license away. You can't practice, right? As an attorney, if my license gets pulled, I can't practice law. As a medical professional, if you don't have a license, you lose your nursing license, you can't do that job anymore. Daycare providers, driving, right? DWIs, you can't drive. But yet the post board allows officers to keep their license while they're on paid administrative leave, when they're on non-paid administrative leave, when they're facing criminal charges for murdering George Floyd. I haven't seen the post board say, you know what, we need to reevaluate how we give out our licensure and what we do when this happens, when misconduct happens. Because at the end of the day, the problem is, right, if not criminally convicted, which we know historically, you're most likely not going to be convicted as an officer, right? The only officer who was convicted was Officer Noor. And you can still get your license. So yes, Minneapolis may not employ you, but that doesn't mean Bloomington won't, or St. Cloud. So not only I think the post board is super important in this, and there needs to be a conversation, right? Let's get on the table and talk to them, right? Where's the hangups? I have no idea. Maybe it's the hangup with the union. Maybe there's some weird contract out there. I have no idea. But we need to get the conversation started and people thinking about, hey, licensed peace officer, you take away your license, we do it for every other job. Why don't we do it for officers, especially police misconduct?
Sure. And how does that, in your mind, do you tie, someone's post license being taken away to only when they're criminally convicted? In your mind, how does that work?
No, I wouldn't say no when they're criminally convicted that it's an automatic. I mean, I guess I would equate it to what I know, right? And what I know is criminal law. You lose your license the minute you're charged with a DWI from the DMV, right? You don't have to be convicted of a DWI to lose your license or have licensure implications, right? So to me, that tells me there's no reason that we can't do that with officers. Until I'm told otherwise, I don't know what I don't know, right? I don't know if that's feasible, but in my mind, that's the type of conversations I would love to have.
And that, your last point there was, something that was a consistent theme in when we were talking in our previous conversations about this topic, which, we've had before, because we're both interested in this. But one of the things you were referencing was, not necessarily that, you have all the answers or the PCOC committee has all the answers, but really what we want and what we need more than anything right now is to sit down and have a conversation with all the interested people and not excluding the people who are impacted in the community, that type of thing. And just, I'd like you to talk about that and why you think that that's so important.
Well, I think it's important because I'm not very PC, so I'm just going to say it how I would normally say it, right? I think it's very arrogant of people to make decisions on behalf of other people without talking to them or asking them if this is what they want or need, right? So me as the chair of PCOC, right, I want to talk to the people it's going to affect, right? I want to hear from them. I can only speak about my own thing, so I'm Colombian, right? I'm a proud Colombian, super proud to be Colombian. The whole Latinx thing, to put it into kind of social context. Nobody ever asked me or the Latina community, Latin community, if we want this, if we accept it, right? It's my understanding that it was created by essentially corporate America, right, to be all inclusive. Well, you didn't ask the one demographic of people who you are describing if this is a word that we want to embrace, that we want to use. And I use that just to kind of give an example of, what do people want? Do people want a crisis intervention team? Maybe. But did they know there was co-responder model that was fully funded in Minneapolis that maybe just needed to be expanded on ours, right? We don't know what. So that's my real thought is like, we need to include the people that not only that have the money, because let's be real, we need the money and we need the backing for these programs, but we need to ask the people who it's going to directly impact if this is what they want. I mean, and I think I recognize that so much because I am a public defender and the judges do a whole bunch of things that are detrimental to my clients that they probably don't realize are super detrimental to my clients. You know, and this summer, as we talked about with you know, the murder of George Floyd and what ensued nationwide from there. And then you talk about defunding of the police and, you know, officers need to be, you know, there's so many things going on. And my thought is like, why can't we do this all simultaneously? You know, going back to in the meantime, that's how I feel. In the meantime, how do we change this? But in the meantime, take what we have and improve it so that it is working. Because I don't want to leave the citizens of Minneapolis with nothing. And that's the concern, right? When you say defund the police, that's unhelpful. But if you would talk about reprioritizing, restructuring, and reforming the police, you could have a better conversation, right? Reprioritizing the police is what we rely for police on, right? I don't think it's safe to rely on the cops for everything. For homelessness, they're not social workers. They never wanted to be social workers. So why are we asking them to do that? Mental health, right? Why are we asking them to intervene? If they wanted to be a mental health professional, they would have, right? We need to be looking at that. We need to be looking at restructuring them, right? Who pays for what and what money they get, but also like, what does policing look like? What does policing in the 3rd precinct look like versus the 4th precinct, right? Versus, you know, what does each community need? And then overall, what does Minneapolis need? Like, those are the conversations we should be having.
And one of the things, just so I get this right, you said reprioritize, restructure, and reallocate. Was that it?
Reallocate's one, but also reform. I guess the reallocation part is more specifically for is monetarily, right? Like, how do we reallocate that money? I think if you talk about, you know, reforming, not only does that include the reallocation of funding, but you talk about training, right? And you talk about oversight. I mean, in my world, every police department would have some hybrid model that worked for them for civilian oversight, right? Because really what I tried to do is bridge the gap. And I think I said that at my first meeting, is that my goal is to bridge the gap, because right now civilians are over here and the police are over here and nobody's talking to one another. And so how do we get the steps to go forward to move in the meantime while we're trying to change the laws and how they, you know, how they keep their licensure? I mean, going back to your question, no, they should lose their license after a certain number of complaints, right? An A-level violation becomes a B-level violation at some point. And just for those listening and watching, like, the more you get of those, the more severity your punishment is, right? Within the department. You know, if I've been reprimanded 27 times, maybe this is not the job for me. Right? So that is all part of the reforming and the restructuring and reprioritizing. I mean, we really can do some great police policy work as community members. But I think we all need to have more of these conversations, right? And really know what's out there. I think that because I served under 3 mayors, I was able to see how each mayor differently interacts. I can tell you Mayor Hodges was deeply invested in OPCR and PCOC. She had one of her aides at my meeting every Tuesday. And we did monthly meetings with her, and I did monthly meetings with Rondo because she was invested. And we did some really great work during her time. I mean, the ketamine study, I just gave an interview with New York, with a journalist out of New York on our ketamine study, because she's doing a nationwide ketamine. I mean, I don't know if anyone's read that. I'll briefly tell you about it. Essentially, our body cam policy requires that we randomly audit body cams. So there's somebody in the office of OPCR that sits and reviews body cams. And part of our purview is to look at patterns and trends. Well, he kept noticing that this ketamine kept coming up, right? And it was EMTs and MPD officers shooting people with ketamine, or an officer suggesting like, hey, maybe you should give a shot of ketamine. That's well outside the MPD, like they're not doctors, right? They're not EMTs. That is what that research and study showed, is this is what's happening on body cams. This is a problem that needs to be corrected immediately. Once that study was released, there was no policy for it in the MPD, right? There was one created immediately, and I think it was rolled out within 48 hours. And the way that it's rolled out, so that people know, is essentially Chief Arredondo says, hey, this needs to be rolled out at roll call 8 a.m. tomorrow morning, right? So that means every department that's doing roll call, this is the new rule, this is the new policy, there you go. Plus it's emailed to them as well, and then they're reminded these are the new policies. But that's essentially how that happened. And that was really great work, but that was also investment from the people who are providing us money, right?
Sure. So I have one question. We have 1 minute left, so you're gonna have to answer this relatively quickly. But the question is essentially, in talking about restructuring or reforming, what do you have a response to people who say basically, the idea of law enforcement or policing at a foundation level has an issue because of how police started? If you go back to sort of, the slave catchers, that type of thing, that basically our system on a foundation level is broken and we need to get rid of that foundation before we can move forward. How do you respond to that?
Yes. Yeah, I think that the foundation is broken, and that the underlying foundation of policing, right, which stems from slave catchers and in controlling this population of people, right, that does need to be completely wiped out. I'm not so sure about, doing a whole Thanos moment and snapping our fingers and now there's no officers whatsoever. I would go back to that I'm the in the meantime person, right? So while we reimagining what policing looks like in the 21st century, Anthony Newby in North Minneapolis had worked on that since Jamar Clark's murder. And so he's imagined policing without police with community members. So yes, fundamentally, we need to restructure and completely reform the police department from that ideology that I need to control a population, right? But in the meantime, how do we change what's currently happening? Because like I said, we're not going to wake up tomorrow and there's not going to be any cops. So we need to be focusing on in the meantime.
Yeah. Well, great. Thank you very much, Andrea, for joining us. And we all appreciate your insights, and I appreciate you taking your time from your busy public defender schedule, and you're also your newborn baby. So I know you're very, very busy, but we all appreciate it and appreciate your insights. And for anybody who's listening, we intend to have a few more conversations as part of this series after the new year. But thanks everybody for joining us today, and have a good holiday.